welcome to part 3 of Dr. Peter Kreeft's Arguments for God, where I'll take on and completely demolish another 5 of his 20 claims, which are so horribly and irrationally put together that I've got no idea how a supposedly educated man could ever have thought any of them were a good idea. But he's not operating out of his education, but out of his blind faith, and holy crap does it show. I really don't know what else to say, except hold on to your butts, because this is about to get stupid. After a while, it feels like he's not even trying. In fact, I think he betrays the fact that these are not actually arguments at all, just ideas that might appeal to certain people in certain situations, so he might as well throw them all out there. He says that this one might appeal to someone who shares a Platonic view of knowledge, someone who already believes that there are eternal intelligible forms. In fact, he actually argues that this is a bad argument because there's too much about the theory of knowledge that needs to be said, and presumably understood, before this can be used as a persuasive demonstration. So why is it in his list of 20 arguments for God? Doesn't he know how to proofread? But hey, we're here anyway. Let's take a look at it. Now he says it comes mostly from Augustine, and he's phrased it as such. 1. Our limited minds can discover eternal truths about being. 2. Truth properly resides in a mind. 3. But the human mind is not eternal. 4. Therefore, there must exist an eternal mind in which these truths reside. Now you'd have to define what you mean by eternal truths about being. Such as, because I'd honestly argue that these truths are often nonsense. Philosophically, truths are not the same as facts. Facts exist externally to the observer. Truths depend on the observer for context, and that makes truth subjective. What is true for one person may not be true for another, and that makes it very problematic for purposes of coming to an objective view of reality. He goes on to say that truth properly resides in a mind. Well, since truth is questionable at best and completely subjective at worst, what's the point? Now I went looking for a definition of what a eternal truth about being might be and came back with ideas from Descartes and Augustine, but they all read like personal opinions, not like anything that can be demonstrated to be actually so. So really, the idea that opinions can only reside in a mind might be true, but since these opinions are just overblown nonsense, calling them eternal truths about being is just silly. And so it goes, like so many of these other arguments, just defining some God figure into existence, it just has to be there. But it doesn't. It's just patently absurd hyper-emotionalism. I've got these ideas, and I want to think that they're bigger than myself, so I'll arbitrarily invent something to have these ideas for me. And you think that's somehow impressive. I mean, Jesus, talk about an overblown sense of self-importance. But it only gets worse from there. The next one argues that we could never come up with the idea of God unless God was real. Yeah, I'll let that one sink in for a moment while we look at his actual argument that he takes from Descartes. 1. We have ideas of many things. 2. These ideas must arise either from ourselves or from things outside us. 3. One of the ideas that we have is the idea of God, an infinite, all-perfect being. 4. This idea could not have been caused by ourselves because we know ourselves to be limited and imperfect, and no effect can be greater than its cause. 5. Therefore, the idea must have been caused by something outside us, which has nothing less than the qualities contained in the idea of God. 6. But only God himself has those qualities. 7. Therefore, God himself must be the cause of the ideas we have of him. 8. Therefore, God exists. Now, I'm going to say one word that totally blows this entire load of philosophical masturbation out of the water. You ready for this? Superman. Because humans are such limited, imperfect beings that we could never, ever, ever come up with the idea of a man who can leap tall buildings with a single bound. Yes, Siegel and Schuster couldn't have come up with that on their own, so they must have been modeling Superman after a real being. I mean, it's not like we could have thought up the concept of flying cars, because we all know that cars don't fly. Therefore they must. In fact, every single thing that humans have imagined that didn't exist must have already existed, or we couldn't have come up with it. Because humans are stupid, at least according to Kreeft and his religious cronies. Nope, somebody might be stupid here, and I'll give you 3 guesses who it might be. Alright, let's get on to something else because those last 2 were just painfully idiotic. This one is Anselm's ontological argument, which I've taken on before, but hey, I might as well do another workup here. It says, 1. It is greater for a thing to exist in the mind and in reality than in the mind alone. 2. God means that than which a greater cannot be thought. 3. Suppose that God exists in the mind but not in reality. 4. Then a greater than God could be thought, namely a being that has all the qualities our thought of God has, plus real existence. 5. But this is impossible, for God is that than which a greater cannot be thought. 6. Therefore God exists in the mind and in reality. Right off the bat, I'd ask how you define greater. For that matter, the definition provided for God is not what he says it is. I can find absolutely no dictionary that defines the word God that way. But I can take this argument out exactly the same way I did with the previous one. Superman! It is far greater that Superman exists in reality than in the mind alone. Therefore, Superman must exist. And flying cars, and super powerful aliens, and every other thing man has ever conceived of. All of it must exist because apparently it's far greater for these things to actually exist in reality than only in the mind of man. And this is something that's been known since Anselm proposed this argument. We can go back to the very first person who ever responded to it, who said that it's impossible that the most maximally beautiful island does not exist in reality because it's better to exist in reality than in the mind. And Anselm even admitted that his argument relied on the ambiguity of the terms he used. But beyond that, this relies on the common apologetic tool of defining God into existence. See, there's no way to actually prove that this God thing has any of the characteristics that theists arbitrarily assign to it. Theists have no means of pointing to any actual God and studying it to find out what characteristics it actually has. Therefore, those characteristics are just made up, just like the characteristics Siegel and Schuster made up when they made Superman. Theists have no means of proving that what they say is actually so, and we have no reason to take any of it seriously. If I say that Superman is the maximally great man and therefore must exist, that doesn't mean Superman exists. This whole thing is just painfully stupid. But the pain goes on and on and on as we move to the moral argument. Kreeft states it as such. 1. Real moral obligation is a fact. We are really truly objectively obligated to do good and avoid evil. 2. Either the atheistic view of reality is correct or the religious one. 3. But the atheistic one is incompatible with there being moral obligation. 4. Therefore, the religious view of reality is correct. First off, prove that moral obligation is a fact. Go ahead, because I don't think that any apologist can actually defend that view. From a social standpoint, yes, we are expected to do what society views as good and to avoid doing what society views as evil. This is the very basis for legality, but objectively obligated? I don't think you have any means for making that claim. But as expected, he follows his typical course and engages in a false dichotomy. Either the atheist view or the religious view is right, and he arbitrarily disposes of the atheist view and declares himself to be the victor. Sorry, nobody with half a clue is impressed. So let's actually dig a little deeper and see why theists are so wrong on this issue. The problem is, there's no such thing as objective morality. Theists don't like that, but I've talked about this many times before, and no theist has ever been able to say more than, "I'm right, so there." There's simply no evidence for a single objectively defensible moral standard throughout space and across time. It just doesn't exist. The idea that there is completely intellectually indefensible. But they don't operate on intellect. They operate on emotion, and that's why they get into trouble. The basis for all morality, when you get right down to it, is enlightened self-interest. We all want to be treated well. Therefore, we treat others well in hopes that they will reciprocate. As the individual views of what being treated well means changes, society's views on morality changes as well. What was seen as being moral a century ago, or even a decade ago, might now be seen as being immoral. This has happened in every single human society in the existence of our planet, and it's absolutely not what we would expect to see if there was a single objective standard for morality. In that case, we'd expect to see moral stagnation. We'd expect to see the same moral standards everywhere on the planet at all times. Nothing would ever change. It wouldn't matter what country you were talking about. It wouldn't matter what culture you were talking about. It wouldn't matter what religion you were talking about. They'd all be the same because, as Christians like to say, morality would be written on the human heart. But that's not what we observe. That has never been what we observed. Therefore, theists have to come up with some excuse for why what we see in the real world doesn't match what they believe. This is called self-deception. They are desperately trying to rationalize away reality in favor of their religious fantasies. These people are delusional. Finally, this time around, let's look at the argument from conscience. This is actually a twist on the moral argument and therefore suffers from most of the same problems. It argues that because we have a conscience at all, that some kind of God must exist. And this is, of course, complete bullshit. Kreeft argues that there are 4 places a conscience can come from. 1, from something less than me, which he calls nature. 2, from me, the individual. 3, from others equal to me, society. And 4, from something over me, God. And then he tries to dispose of the ones he doesn't like in favor of the one he does. For the first, he asks, how can I be absolutely obligated by something less than me? For example, by animal instinct or practical need for material survival. Who said anything about obligation? He wonders why animals have instincts, like they constantly ask themselves, well, I really don't want to follow my instincts, but I have this grand moral obligation to do so. Yeah, Peter Kreeft is an idiot. They don't follow it because they have a choice. They follow it because it's programmed by evolution into their genes. Humans have instincts too, although we have, through our big mammalian brains, developed the ability to override our instincts. We, like every other animal on the planet, have a biological drive to reproduce. We want to breed. We just have the ability, if we choose, not to do so. We can opt out of our instincts. That doesn't mean they go away. It just means we have a choice. Next, he says, how can I obligate myself absolutely? Am I absolute? Do I have the right to demand absolute obedience from anyone, even myself? And if I am the one who locked myself into this prison of obligation, I can also just let myself out, thus destroying the absoluteness of the obligation which we admitted in our premise. Again, he's stuck with this whole obligation thing, which is still ridiculous. There is no obligation to do anything. You can reject morality and conscience if you want. In fact, that's exactly what sociopaths do. There are moral nihilists out there who reject the idea that anything is inherently moral or immoral. Some argue that Machiavelli is an example of moral nihilism, although I guess I would question that. Next, he says, how can society obligate me? What right do my equals have to impose their values on me? Does quantity equal quality? Do a million human beings make a relative into an absolute? Is society God? Well, yeah, society does obligate you because humans are inherently social creatures that require society to live. This is actually the answer, but it's not the one he's looking for. Society has the ability to compel you to follow their rules and penalize you if you choose not to. The simple fact is, you need society a lot more than society needs you. A million people might not make a relative into an absolute, but that's because there aren't any absolute moral views. It certainly can make an option into a requirement, which is all that's required. And finally, he softballs the final option with, the only source of absolute moral obligation left is something superior to me, that binds my will, morally, with rightful demands of complete obedience. But that assumes that there are moral obligations at all, which clearly there are not. Ultimately, this is a version of his false dichotomy arguments because he just arbitrarily rejects the other positions in favor of the one he wants. He's never actually demonstrated that the one he wants is actually true. But what else is new? That's really where all this becomes such a mess, because Kreeft and other apologists aren't actually concerned with proving the existence of their gods. They just want to play word games and convince the credulous that their ideas have some merit. Except they don't. If anything, it just proves that these people have no clue what the hell they're talking about. And that comes as no surprise. I mean, they fall for every logical fallacy under the sun. They make claims that are unsupported, they make arguments that are absurd, and they come to conclusions that are simply not backed up by their supposed evidence. These people are fucked up, and proudly so. How so many people are so gullible to take any of this nonsense seriously, I will never understand.